On this episode of the Camp Owners Podcast, Howie and I sit down with two legal experts who have close ties to the camp industry and have a vested interest in making sure that camp is as safe and fun for campers and staff as possible while giving sound advice to camp owners in regards to COVID precautions, vaccinations, and legal issues. We think you will have some very tangible takeaways. We know we did regarding conversations and communications with families, communications and conversations with staff about vaccines and waivers. So we hope you enjoy this episode. We hope you find it as beneficial as we did, and we're so excited for you to listen. Welcome to the Camp Owners Podcast, a space for camp owners to talk about the unique aspects of camp ownership and get inspired by each other. We are going to sit down with camp industry experts, leaders, and fellow camp owners to hear how the camp dream transpired for them, learn from each other, and discuss some of the biggest issues in the private camp industry. Welcome. I am Kelly Shuna, co-owner and director of Hidden Pines Ranch Day Camp in Stillwater, Minnesota.
And hi, everybody. I'm Howie Grossinger, and I am the co-owner and director of Camp Robin Hood, a private day camp in the suburbs of Toronto. If you are looking to find and subscribe to the Camp Owners Podcast, you can either find us online at gocamp.pro/ownerspod or by searching for us in your favorite podcast app. Finally, if you're listening to this and think it would be useful to other camp owners or aspiring camp owners in your circle, please feel free to send them a note to listen. As always, Kelly and I are thrilled to thank our sponsor, Camp Brain. Huge shout out to Camp Brain. As many of you know, Camp Brain camp management software serves over 1,300 camps. They have been doing this since 1994 with 45 plus dedicated, amazing staff to meet your every need with core modules in camper, conference center, fundraising, camp store, and attendance for day camps. Camp Brain has all of the features to meet your camp needs. Happy and proud to be a Camp Brain user. As many of you know, since their inception, they just came out with an early spring update. So they're constantly looking to make their software more usable and updated based on conditions and feedback from users. So please check them out. Thank you to Camp Brain for being the show sponsor. And if you want to learn more about Camp Brain, check them out at campbrain.com or call them at 866-485-8885. Hi, Kelly.
Hello, Howie. How are you?
How you doing? I'm good. How you doing?
I'm great. It's Friday. I don't know if this is going to be released on a Wednesday, but hey, it feels like Friday.
It is a Friday.
I'm all about it. I'm excited for our show today. It feels very regal to be talking about legal issues today. Very businessy. So I'm going to put on my business hat. I still have the party in the back of the camp owner, but definitely having my business in the front today. What we're going to talk about today is as we approach the final stages of summer prep, we thought we would turn our attention to issues that all camp owners should be thinking about. It's the language we're using in staff contracts, communication in families to keep them up to speed with current legal practice, whether it be codes of conduct, camper waiver forms, and especially COVID-related clauses related to testing, vaccination, and cancellation. We thought it would be good to get a legal perspective. We have two great people from both sides of the border, look at us, cross-border episode, to help us with the US and Canadian viewpoints on some of the issues. Rachel Fendel Satinsky, Rachel, I hope I said that correct. Yes, I got a thumbs up. Is with Ladner, an employment and labor law firm based in Philadelphia, and Robin Squires from Borden, Ladner, and Gervais. I hope I said that right too. A law firm in Toronto, or close. Robin can correct me. We really thought that this was a timely topic as many of us are contracting staff or considering COVID-related addendums to their contracts. Welcome, Rachel and Robin. We're so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Howie, thank you for making these connections. We always love to start with having our guests kind of tell us their connection to the camp industry and how, they ended up being on this episode with us. So Rachel, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. I'm so glad to be here with you all today. I love all things camp. I was a camper, a day camp camper, a sleepaway camp camper, a sleepaway camp counselor at two different camps, and now I am the parent of a day camper, eventually to be sleepaway camp campers. So I have sort of seen this from every possible side. And I am so lucky in my practice as a lawyer, an employment lawyer, to get to work with camps. I always say to my camp clients, don't tell other people, but you're my favorite. And I love working with them, love getting to stay involved with all things camp. And again, just really thrilled to be here today.
Great, thank you. And Robin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a partner at BLG. Borden, Ladner, Gervais is correct, but we just call ourselves BLG. It's easier in Toronto. I was a long time ago in a previous life a camp operator. I was a camp director at a YMCA camp in Kingston, Ontario for about 8 years. And shortly after, actually right after I finished that job, I became a lawyer. And I never wanted to turn my back on any of those connections and friendships that I've made when I was in the camping industry. And so I've always tried to give back and help out where I can, and give some advice to the camps, particularly in Ontario, that need legal advice from time to time. And know Howie well from those years, and happy to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you both, and knowing your busy schedules, thanks for freeing up the time for us and our audience. I know Kelly and I have been talking throughout this stage of preparation for the summer camp season. We all, as camp owners and operators, have those check boxes around staffing and ordering and operational stuff and our sites. And of course, we all, over the course of several months, check in with our legal advisors just to make sure that everything we're doing in a typical season is up to standard and is in consideration of all the things we should be thinking about, not only to protect our businesses, but to just make sure that the relationships between our clients and our staff and our camps are where they should be. But we also felt that, you know, in light of COVID and some of the considerations for virtually and all being well, every camp in North America getting back to what they love to do, that this is probably a topic that we wanted to explore, as many of us are contracting staff currently. So I guess, you know, the flow of this conversation is going to be, you know, for each of you and together to give a perspective on, you know, largely what camp operators should be thinking about. Of course, there'll be different approaches depending on jurisdiction and things of that kind. And I use that word as a proud person who knows lawyers, because I know they use that word a lot. So I thought I would just preface all of that, and I'm sure you'll have your necessary disclaimers throughout this this conversation. But you know, generally speaking, Kelly and I are most curious on the staff issue. You know, many of us are contracting staff, and perhaps, you know, we can start with you, Rachel. Of course, we'd love to start with you. What do you think are some of the top staff contractual issues camp operators should be thinking about for 2021? You know, the things that you've been advising your clients about, and what we should be thinking about. And we can then, that could be a springboard to all kinds of good stuff we're going to talk about.
Great. And I'll give my my warning, and I'm sure Robin will give his too, that none of this is intended to be legal advice. This is general guidance, and you should always, of course, consult with your own lawyer, or if you don't have one, feel free to reach out to me and Robin. We can help you, but always best to talk to your own lawyer to get your advice tailored to your particular needs. So with that said, I think, you know, the best thing for camps to do right now is to look at, what does your environment look like? So how is it going to be different? And then work back from there. And so what I say in terms of that is your staff going to have to stay on campus all summer? Is your staff for day camps going to have certain COVID tests at different intervals? Or are you going to ask your staff to be extra cognizant of their behavior on weekends and on days off and things like that? And then once you start to kind of think about, what does this look like, then think about what you need to do to tell your staff and to get that into your contracts, because probably you haven't had staff staying on campus for a whole summer, or you haven't previously had to tell your staff, especially if you didn't operate last summer. You know, we hope and expect that you're very cognizant of your behavior and complying with CDC guidelines here in the US over the course of the summer. And all of those types of things then can be built into staff contracts. And for those of you on the call that are maybe thinking, oh no, I've already been sending out staff contracts, I haven't thought about any of this, no problem. The good news, at least in the US, I won't speak for Canada, but at least in the US, you can create an addendum to your contract. And so you just call it an addendum. It sounds fancy, but it's really just an extra piece of paper that you add onto your contract. It says addendum to contract. And you can add in some of those terms in the addendum and have your staff sign it with all the extra pieces that you need and have thought of. And of course, we would love just one addendum, maybe none, but you can have multiple addendums if you need. There's nothing that says you can't have multiple. So if you think of something else, or if a circumstances change as camp gets closer, you can definitely add those pieces in too.
Wow. I think that is something that I've been thinking about prior to this show of, okay, what have I already sent out? And I'm happy to know that we can send out those extra pieces, those addendums. So I think that's my favorite thing that you talked about. And I think camp owners will appreciate is that just because you've contracted doesn't mean it's too late. Robin, do you want to add your insight on what you think camp owners should be thinking about?
Sure, and I'll just echo what Rachel said about making sure that you check in with your own legal advisors with respect to your specific circumstances. I think it's a bit different in Ontario, and I would guess most of Canada. If you want to make an addendum to a contract that's already been signed, there has to be consideration for that. So you might have to pay your staff another $10 for the season in order to make that addendum binding. But I think that the things that Rachel talked about make a lot of sense, thinking about what your environment looks like, what your camp culture is, what your parents and campers might expect, and what your staff should know about before the season is extremely important. The other thing I think is really important to think about when you're thinking about your staff contracts is what are the various permutations of what this summer might look like. Is it possible that you'll be having to reduce the number of staff that you've hired because your capacity has been limited? Is it possible that you're going to have to send people home for various reasons, whether it's because there's a COVID outbreak, whether there's a particular staff member who didn't follow the rules, whether your local public health unit has decided that you need to reduce your capacity or close for a period of time, whether the province goes back into a lockdown. Think about all those possible outcomes for the summer and plan for it. Put those possibilities into your contract so that everybody going into the summer goes in with eyes wide open about what to expect. And that's the most important thing about contracts is expectations. Make sure that everybody has the right expectations as they go into the summer so they can agree to it, and then you can look back at the contract later and say, well, this is what we all expected, so you shouldn't be surprised.
I know that a lot of learning took place in 2020 with so many camps either being not able due to government restrictions or shutdowns, or the choice not to operate. There were already contracts in place, and young people were expecting to be working. I thought maybe on the line of setting expectations, maybe we could just quickly talk about what happens if that contract needs to be broken, for lack of a better term, because you're not able to operate and you're so far down the road. I'm curious in the US, Rachel, in terms of those types of elements of a contract, should even before the contract is technically supposed to start, that you're forced to cancel the employment arrangement. Maybe you could speak to that just a little, because I'm sure it's on the minds of many camp owners.
Absolutely. And we could spend a whole 3 hours, multiple podcasts on that topic alone. From a general standpoint, in the US under federal law, most camps, and I say most, but most camps are exempt from the minimum wage and overtime requirements of federal law. Many states have a very similar exemption to the federal exemption, but not all do. in the states that have the exemption that matches the federal exemption, if you qualify and your state is not covered by minimum wage or overtime laws, you can literally pay your staff $1 for the summer. Now, you might not get the best staff and you might not get any staff, but you can do that legally under the law. And so because of that, if let's say camp can't happen because of some kind of public shutdown, as you said, Howie, really you don't have to pay your staff anything if camp hasn't started legally. But the important thing to think about is what do you want to do from a reputational standpoint and from sort of a goodwill standpoint, which may be very different than what's required legally. So I think that's a first thing to think about. In the US, we have something called unemployment compensation, which is basically a state service where individuals who are working and then are out of work for the pandemic or other reasons receive benefits from the state, benefits being money, and are entitled to that. And lots of times camps ask me, especially last summer, what happens, or is all of our staff going to go run and get unemployment compensation now? And those are really fact-specific circumstances depending upon the particular staff member. So there's no blanket rule. Yes, if camp has to be canceled or you have to not bring on some portion of your staff or camp has to end early, it's going to depend on the particular staff member, their job, whether they worked in the prior year, all kinds of different things. So there is kind of no general blanket rule with that. There's also been a lot of talk, I know, in the camp industry about what happens if we have a staff member who contracts COVID during the summer and we have to send them home. So they've worked for us, they've got to go home. And our policy is they can't come back for the rest of the summer once they've contracted COVID. Once you've left, you're done. Same sort of thing. Pay them whatever you have paid them. From a legal perspective, whatever you've paid them is already coverage as long as you meet those federal and state exemptions. But think about kind of the broader picture on it. And you may very well, and a friend of mine, Alan Cooper, who's in the camp industry, says this a lot. He's at AM Skyer, and Alan talks about, which I think is really important, do the right thing because it will pay dividends down the road. So, if you've got a counselor that leaves at week 5 and technically isn't entitled to payment until they leave camp on the last day of week 8, think about just paying them, right? It's not their fault they got COVID, probably. It's the right thing to do. It's right for them. It's probably the kind of culture you want to promote at camp, because one of the things that I love about camp is everyone is really good-natured and good-hearted and wants to do the right thing. And I think when you do those things, right, word gets out amongst your staff. So they had to send, Howie home. It was really unfortunate. Howie was bummed to leave camp. But Howie told all of his friends at camp that how camp took care of him and how he really appreciated that. And he's excited to come back next summer because of how camp showed him they cared about him. So a little bit of a long-winded answer there. But no general rules. Those are just sort of some general principles to think about.
Yeah, and before I'd love for Robin to weigh in a moment, but I think this last part of this is such important things for all camp owners to consider. And we all, whether we're a new operator or come from a tradition of family succession in the operation of our camp, much of our livelihood has been built on the goodwill and reputation that we have in our varied communities, whether they be local at day camps or global in the sense of overnight camps. And so I think that while I've often had this question over my entire career of how do you balance the beauty of this industry of being the people we are who run our businesses and we're spirited and we're loving and we do these things with the necessary business elements that we need to apply because we're business owners and we have bottom lines and we do this. And I think in the case of this example, we're really trying to bring together what is responsible, but also what is, helps us move forward in the most positive way. And I know from advice from people like Robin, for me personally, for those of us who can afford or even may not afford the effort of paying out a contract or paying an extra week than legally your jurisdiction tells you you have to, can often just go a long way, because we know that those moms and dads are sitting at the local restaurant, and the chatter for sure that weekend is about how that issue was handled perhaps. So, and those are important to us as camp operators. So I'm really glad you added that element. And I think I'm sure many of us are thinking along those lines, but it's nice to hear it from you in the work that you do, that we need to have that balance. Robin, your thoughts on Rachel's sort of thoughts on the contractual issues, but also her thoughts on this last piece as well.
Yeah, I thought Rachel's answer was fantastic. It's exactly the kind of answer that I would give to a camp that called me with that concern. I think back to when I was camp director and working at the Y, and a number of times when I would be in, let's call them business-related disputes with either suppliers or with parents about registrations or something that happened at camp. And I was a young guy, I took things personally, and I would always go and talk to the CEO of the Y, who was my boss, and he would just say, do the right thing. Don't worry, don't get so caught up in the personal, feeling like your professionalism has been insulted. Just do the right thing and pay the staff member out, or refund the money, or pay the supplier and then find a different one later. It's not worth the effort and the emotional involvement that you get into to get into that kind of dispute and keep it going. Just as Rachel said, pay them out if you can, because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes you may not be able to. And in Ontario, contractually, for most of us, for our summer staff or our seasonal staff in particular, there is no required amount that you need to pay somebody out if they are leaving, or you have to ask them to leave. They're still within the statutory probationary period for their contract. So you don't have to pay them anything at all in most cases, but sometimes it's just the right thing to do. There is one aspect in Ontario that's worth keeping in mind, though, which is that if you send somebody home for having COVID, one of your staff, and they want to come back and they're medically cleared to come back, you do have a duty under law to give them their job back, if it's available, if it's not the end of the summer. So if they leave on day 1 of camp and they want to come back on day 15, you have to keep their job for them. That's something that hasn't changed since the beginning, at least in Ontario. So something important to keep in mind.
Something else that I think this conversation brings up is there's been a lot of talk, at least here in the US, about vaccine requirements. And it's something that we've reached out to our employment lawyer about. And actually this morning on NPR, I just heard a conversation about that. So I'm curious to know from your perspectives where you think that's going, and what your thoughts are on for camps running this summer. Is this a hot issue? Is this a hot button issue I'm bringing up? I'm getting all fiery here.
The $1 million question. I can tell you for all of our clients at our firm, not just the camp clients, this is the $1 million question. Every employer, I think, across the world wants to know, what can we do to get our people back in the office? And can we require vaccines, or how can we encourage our workforce to get vaccinated? For better or worse, the answer in the US is not entirely clear at the moment. It's a gray area, and the reality is that we've never dealt with this before in our lifetime. So we've never had a vaccine come out in the US under emergency use authorization to try to solve and remedy a pandemic. It's just never happened in our lifetimes. And so, we are doing the best we can to sort of guess and anticipate what things will look like. And ultimately, the law will shape itself in that area over time, probably not in time for this summer. And so we, use sort of our best guess isn't really the right word, but our best thoughts based on our experience. And there are some camps I've talked to who are mandating vaccines. And is there some legal risk there? Yes, there is, especially if you get to the point of saying, I'm going to terminate somebody's contract or not have them work at camp this summer because they won't be vaccinated. And some of those camps are saying, I'm okay with the risk, because to me, the most important thing is to tell my families that everyone here is vaccinated and that we are taking this seriously and this is what we're doing. And if I have to have some risk, I can handle that. There are other camps I've talked to that have said, we're not going to mandate it. We're going to encourage it, strongly encourage it. Both in words and in incentive. So some camps are talking about an extra PTO day or an extra night off. And I've joked about this before, but I know it's true in the camp industry. T-shirts, historic T-shirts, right? They're gold at camp. So maybe you're going to have some kind of special raffle where, if you're vaccinated, you get your name in the hat and you have a chance, to win the Color War T-shirt from 1975 that's still around. So there are different ways to do this. If you are going to mandate vaccines and you decide that's the way you want to go, I strongly, strongly encourage you to speak with lawyers about that. There are ways to do it, but there are a number of exceptions in the US that you have to consider, which also we could do a whole other podcast on. So just let me know, and we'll do a whole other day on that if anyone's interested. But it is pretty nuanced, and so you do want to make sure if you're mandating it that you're walking through the proper steps based on what we know now.
And Robin, in Ontario, truth be told, at the time of the recording of this episode, the vaccine rollout in our area hasn't been as swift as it is in the States. And I know that I've been speaking to lots of friends, camp operators, south of the border, and they're already, issuing letters of, confirmation that, young people are working at camps, and, CDC has allowed those people to go to their local vaccination centers, and it's very acceptable. And I'm hearing numbers like already 65% of my staff 18 and over have been vaccinated, which is, music to everyone's ears, because it's a wonderful communication piece, obviously, to your parents when you can say that. Not so lucky here yet in Canada. We're working towards that. But as it relates to contract and, the issues of requiring versus suggesting, which is, this is our hope. Robin, what's your perspective on the stuff that, Rachel has shared thus far?
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if we had a government that said that people who work at camp are essential workers and should be first in line after, the first set of essential workers, obviously, but to allow the kids to have some fun at camp this summer. That would be incredible. But you're right, we're not there. I don't know if we'll ever get there. But let's say for a moment that vaccines are available to the staff, and camp wants to mandate it. Here in Ontario, it's a gray area, but they're a little more clear. There was a case already brought against a long-term care facility that was mandating vaccines for its staff, and it was found to be a bona fide employment requirement, and that vaccine mandate was upheld for a long-term care facility. And it's a vulnerable population, and perhaps you can make the argument that a summer camp is a similar situation. It's still a gray area. It hasn't been challenged. The key thing is to think about it in terms of whether it is a bona fide employment requirement. I would argue strongly that it is for a summer camp. I compare summer camps to cruise ships. I think in both environments, having the staff vaccinated just is a safety issue, and needs to happen. The one thing that you have to think about though, when you're talking about mandating vaccines is the Human Rights Code. There is a Human Rights Code in Ontario that certain beliefs are protected by the code. Some religious beliefs may not allow someone to be vaccinated. They may feel, based on a religious value, that vaccination isn't something that they're prepared to do. In addition, there could be a health concern. There could be a health-related reason why someone can't be vaccinated or doesn't wish to be vaccinated, and the Human Rights Code protects those grounds. And so those are things to keep in mind. Even a carte blanche, everybody must be vaccinated policy may not be effective based on the situation that you're in. And you need to canvass that with your own legal counsel if it comes up.
Great, that's awesome. Rachel, your thoughts on any of those human rights related issues? I don't know if that's what you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, here in the US, I referred a little bit to some exceptions that have to be made, and those are similar to those in Canada that Robin just talked about. So, sincerely held religious beliefs, folks with medical conditions, those are two of the big areas here as well, where even if you want to mandate and you're okay taking that risk, you are going to have some population that has to be, if they qualify, exempt from that requirement, and that's protected for them under the law.
Great. Well, I want to, this is great because we've set the table for some more in the weeds kind of questions, because these are things that I know the people I'm talking to are asking right now. So here are two more on the vaccine issue. Number one, how careful should directors be who are still hiring to add questions related to willingness to get to the vaccine as part of the hiring process is one. I'd love to get, Robin, we can start with you in just a moment for that one. And number two, the question, and this came up with some day camp friends of ours, and I think it applies to sleepaway camp as well, but choices you make while operating for those staff who are vaccinated and those that aren't vaccinated, and what kind of, the eligibility of the 1985 Howie's first staff t-shirt contest, which would be gross if we did that, but nonetheless. But the point is that I'm curious about, advice that operators should be thinking about, drawing the line between the vaccinated bunch versus the unvaccinated bunch and that stuff. So maybe, Robin, we can start with you on those two topics to start with.
Sure. I think you need to take a great deal of care with the types of questions you want to ask your staff before you hire them about their willingness to get the vaccine, because those kinds of questions can go directly to the Human Rights Code issues that I mentioned. And if you decide that you're not going to hire somebody who isn't willing to get the vaccine, and the reason they aren't willing to get the vaccine is because of a health concern that they haven't disclosed to you or sincerely held religious belief, then you're open for a human rights complaint. And so I would strongly recommend you to do your hiring without that in mind, but feel free to let your staff know that it's a likelihood that vaccines are going to be a requirement wherever they can be, because it's a safety issue, and see how that goes. It'll probably go a little bit better than opening yourself up to the human rights complaint. As for using staff for different purposes, the only thing stopping you from doing that in Ontario is the Human Rights Code. It could be considered discrimination in employment. However, the Human Rights Code in Ontario says you only have to accommodate someone's protected ground to the point of undue hardship. And so if there is a safety reason why you have to have vaccinated staff in the cabins sleeping with the kids, and the non-vaccinated staff running the program areas where they're not in such close contact and they're outdoors, that sounds like a reasonable accommodation that a human rights tribunal would likely uphold. But every case is going to be different. Every situation is going to be different. And so you really have to think about them on a case-by-case basis.
Awesome. Rachel, your thoughts on those two topics?
Robin couldn't have said it better. Everything that Robin just said is equally applicable here in the States. And I think the words that Robin used at the end were great care, take great care in what you do. And I would implore that on everybody too, because obviously protecting the safety and well-being of everyone at camp is your utmost priority. And that is critical and so important. At the same time, your staff members do have rights under the law, and you have to be careful not to run afoul of those rights, especially as you're trying to do all you can to ensure the safety and health of everyone on camp. And so there is sometimes that conflict. And so when you run into those situations, you have to be really careful. And here in the US, there's a process under the law that's required called the interactive process for somebody who has a religious belief or a medical condition that would prevent them from being vaccinated. And it's a fancy term, but basically it means have a discussion with them about what their needs are and understand what their needs are and why they need it. We also have in the US the undue hardship standard. It is a very, very high standard to meet with respect to medical conditions and disabilities. It is a little bit lower of a standard with religious beliefs. But what I've said to many camps is that you might think you meet the undue hardship standard and because of the health and safety of your campers. But now that COVID tests are becoming more accessible, you have to think about other things too. So yes, is it critical that people are healthy and safe? Yes, but you may also be able to get a level of assurance if the person who can't be vaccinated is going to be tested every other day for COVID, let's say, or something along those lines, or the person will be masked whenever around children. And so while you might want to say, no way, we're not going to have this person, you have to take a step back, even if your intentions are good, and I know they are, and thinking we just want everything to be safe. Take a step back before you get there and really think about, is there some other way that we can make this work for this person? And you don't have to do that for people who don't qualify because of a medical reason or religious reason. Like if somebody's an anti-vaxxer, that's not protected here.
Not in
At least
Ontario
right
either.
now.
Not a protected ground.
But take that step and just kind of think before you act, because again, the intentions are so good, but staff members do have rights, and there may be ways to accommodate things and to still assure your parents that for various reasons, we do have some staff members who aren't vaccinated without going into those specific reasons, because of course, any medical information about your staff members should be held very confidentially on a need to know basis only in lock cabinet files with, a key and away from their other personnel files, all of that good stuff, or, on a software platform in a separate area that only certain people have access to and is password protected. So, don't tell your staff members, hey, Jimmy has asthma. And because Jimmy has asthma, he's not being vaccinated. And Jimmy's your kid's counselor. So just FYI, not a good idea, not a good thing to do at all. Don't do that. But fine to kind of generally say, for various reasons, we have some staff who won't be vaccinated this summer. Here are the precautions we're taking with respect to those staff members. And I think, and as a parent, if I got that kind of communication, I think that's a great communication to get. That shows me that the camp is thinking. They're thinking about this. They're making the preparations. They're taking the care. And so I think even though you might think this isn't the best news to convey, as a parent, I would feel pretty good getting that as well.
Rachel, will you repeat for me the word you use for those formal conversations with those staff? Because I really liked it and I want to take it. I'm a note taker.
The interactive process.
Oh, thank you. I want to know when I call people, I'll be having this. This is an interactive process conversation. I put on my glasses too, by the way, for this conversation. I'll wear them for that. Rachel, I think you bring up a really great point, and Robin as well, and how I don't know if you can relate to this, but I think this is it's a really conflicting feeling as a camp owner, because our campsite, we're feelers. We want, we have empathy. We, are such ties, this close ties with our staff and our camp families and our community. But then the business side of us feels very conflictual for me right now, with wanting to have people vaccinated and for the summer and what that looks like as a business owner, but also being empathetic where people are coming from. And it's just a really interesting time. And I love gray, but I'm kind of tired of gray at this moment. And I had a conversation with a friend who is in HR for an early childhood center. And for her, she's feeling like, if they ask me to mandate this for my staff, I will walk. I'm done working at this business. And it's interesting for me to hear, because I'm that business who at least is thinking, I'm thinking about it and having that. And it's just that it's an unprecedented time. And I think we bring in we've never done that. Schools have never mandated it. Hospitals have never. We've never had the government tell us what to do, but we've also never been in this place, at least in our lifetime. So I just think it's a really interesting growth opportunity time as camp owners. What do you think about that, Howie?
I agree. And, I think that, as I said before, it's these coming together of this business world and the camp world. And this is why we went into this business. And there are moments in our careers where these things meet in a place that if you go one way, you can be viewed in a certain light. And if you go others, you can easily be seen as someone who is not as perhaps responsible, for the care of other people's children and the care of, as an employer, the care of your staff. So it's a line that I think we're all straddling right now. But I'm buoyed in the confidence that, through conversations like this, and I had the pleasure of listening to Rachel at the Northeast Camp Conference, and it was a wonderful conversation. And I know many of the people I know well in camping were attending. So we're all interested, and I think at its heart, we all want to do the right thing, and knowing, where our thinking should be is just super helpful. So that's really, really good.
Mm-hmm. A conversation my husband and I have been having a lot the past year is, if they do a story on the decisions we made during this time, will we like how that story is portrayed? Will we feel like that's a positive reflection of the two of us at camp owners? So it's always in those decisions. Okay, Kelly, if they make a story about our decision or how we reacted or what we decided for choices for our business, how will we feel about how that is presented or portrayed? So yes, a lot of.
And I know that Robin wants in, and I'd love to hear his thoughts on this. But that at the beginning of COVID, we had Steve Baskin, Champions Camp in Texas, and he was saying that a lot of his decision making is, I'm not so worried about that. I'm thinking about what is the 10 year from now, Steve, going to think about the decisions I made 10 years, previous kind of thing. And I think that's as applicable to any aspect of our operation as it is COVID, right? It's such a filter, that a lens we should be looking through when we make all kinds of decisions or policy issues or whatever. I mean, yes, we as camp directors, I just know, for me, the amount of time I pour into just making sure that communication is just right and sets the, we're that kind of industry. So I think it's well said. Robin, I know you wanted in on this a little bit.
Yeah, not to overcomplicate things more than they already have been complicated by Rachel and I, but the other thing that you have to consider when it comes to staff at camp is that, at least in Ontario, and I'm sure it's similar in the United States, there's a duty of an employer to make sure that their employees have a safe workplace. And so that's layered on top of all these concerns about safety and vaccinations and human rights and everything else. And you have to think about where you're requiring people to work and how you're requiring people to work, and making sure that everybody's working in a safe workplace, or you could be exposing yourself to a Ministry of Labor problem. But I just wanted to layer on to the conversation about communication. Every time I have a conversation with a camp about a problem that they're having, a concern that they have, something that's keeping them up at night, the answer almost always is communication. And the term that I've already forgotten that Rachel used for that in the United States is a great one. But all of these topics, everything that's on our list of bullet points for this conversation, can be addressed through good communication. Open communication, talking to your parents, talking to your campers, talking to your staff, putting it in the materials that you're sending to them, letting everybody know what to expect. Communication is the key, and it's going to be even more key this summer than ever before.
Robin, it's like we planned this because we wanted to move into communication. And I really liked what Rachel also said about saying to our family or telling our families for various reasons, some of our, if we go this route, some of our staff are not vaccinated and here's the precautions. So I really like some of those tangible things that we can at least be thinking about or using in those conversations. So, and in those communications. So can we talk a little bit about when we're communicating with families for this coming summer, what do you think we should be thinking about and doing right now and leading up to the start of camp?
I can chime in with a couple of thoughts on that. I think, and there again, this goes for so many contexts in camp, but really from our perspective as lawyers and us being as risk adverse as we are, it's prepare for the worst. And by that I mean have a letter ready to go now to parents that says that their son or daughter's counselor has COVID and here's what's happening and here are the steps that you're doing. I hope for everybody at the end of the summer you can rip that up and throw it out and add it to the campfire, and that's what you want to do. But knowing how busy the summer is already, on top of all of the other considerations this summer, really the last thing you want to be doing is finding out at 11 o'clock you have a counselor who tested positive and having to think through what am I going to say and how am I going to say it, right? Your mind is much clearer now than it would be at that moment in time. So having those letters and various processes in place now will serve you well in the summer. And I think having the letters and the exercise of going through what communications are we going to send out if X, if Y, if Z also helps you from a planning standpoint, right? So not only are you going to have to notify certain people if a counselor tests positive, and again, in the US, you don't want to identify who the specific person is who was tested positive, just to say a counselor with whom your son or daughter has interacted. Something, again, very general, even though I'm sure everyone on camp will know, in under 2 minutes who the person is. You don't want to be, putting it out there. Use that as kind of a backup. Okay, if we have a staff member who tests positive, other than sending this communication out, what do we have to do at camp? How do we get the person off camp if we need to? How do we quarantine them at camp? What if somebody won't come pick them up? We can't put them on a plane or a bus. Where are we going to take them? Right? If we need to get medical care, any kind of urgent medical care, how are we going to get that into camp in a way that doesn't alarm the rest of the camp? And so thinking through all those processes again, next summer when all camps are open, I'll come celebrate with all of you and throw all these papers again in a campfire. But I think you can't be more prepared. You can't be over prepared for potential different scenarios that are going to come up this summer. And in terms of communication, back to your original question, Kelly, you have not just families, but you obviously have to make some kind of announcement at camp that this has happened. And so how are you going to make that announcement? And how is that going to be communicated in a way that protects the individual's privacy, which you have an obligation to do here under the law, while also reassuring people that they are safe, they are healthy, you are taking care to remedy the situation and you're on top of it.
Oh, yeah. Have you been a camp director before, Rachel? Like that was beautiful. That's another session at a conference that is just like, here's the operational checklist. That was amazing, but it comes from years of experience and obviously good, amazing advice you've been giving camp owners, I'm sure, for some years now. Robin, your thoughts on this communication piece with families?
Yeah, I thought that answer was fantastic, Rachel, and it brought me back to the days when you'd be sitting in the camp office in January or February and drafting up your emergency response plan. What are you going to do if a fire happens or a tornado hits the camp, or God forbid you have to evacuate somebody from a canoe trip? What's your emergency response plan? And we all go through that exercise. hopefully every summer and make sure our plans are up to date. And this is exactly the situation that you're in, and having those plans in place is such a great idea. And I'm so glad Rachel talked about that. I think as far as the communication piece goes, outside of that, I am aware of some camps who, have told their parents of their campers exactly what to expect this summer. Here's what we're going to do if this happens, and here's what we're going to do if that happens. And I think that's really, really important too. And I know in some parts of North America, and certainly in Ontario, it's pretty early to make those calls because we don't really know what's going to happen. But planning for that and trying to come up with those communication pieces once we do know a little bit more specific about what's going to happen, and making sure that you're sending out that information to your parents so that they know that their children are going to be safe at your camp. I think that's extremely important too.
I'd like to now move to talking about the contractual arrangement that camp owners have with families, and maybe get your perspectives on a couple of topics that I know discussions have been generated amongst the group of people that I speak with. Number one is, I have this vision, old school movie reference, but Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Willy Wonka at the end of the tour says, the fine print, mister, and Charlie and his grandpa get really frustrated, all that stuff. So for those of you who know that reference, although there's a Johnny Depp reference much more recent, but whatever. The point that I'd like to emphasize with that is, when families signed off on sending their kids to camp, they signed off on what I'll just generally call conditions of registration. And for some of us, we anticipated some COVID-related registration conditions, but now things have evolved to the point that we're also going to have to add potentially addendums to that contractual arrangement. And I'm curious about advice when we do that. I'll be more specific. This issue of, maybe in a day camp environment, there is some rapid testing that goes on, and we want parents to be able to recognize that that's part of registration. I'm sure that health centers will get confirmation in writing or verbally from parents to go ahead with that. So that may not be the best example. But I'm also thinking in overnight camps, we may have to change our registration to say there might be a COVID testing fee that we need to implement in overnight camp that requires, 5 days in and this time and asymptomatic surveillance testing. I'm just as a general piece of advice, addendums to client contracts. What are some initial thoughts? Robin, maybe we'll start with you on that topic and wherever that goes.
Sure. And if we're talking about, registration agreements and waivers and those kinds of things, I mean, the fact is that once you've accepted a registration and it's been paid for, it's very difficult to make changes to that agreement with the parent. You can do it. You can just tell them that this is the new agreement and we'd like you to sign it. Whether or not it's enforceable is a question for a court to decide later, and without another exchange of consideration different from the original consideration. So the opportunity to go to camp, or the registration fee, or whatever else, it may not be enforceable. Ultimately, though, I think the main question is, what kind of information do you want your parents to have about what to expect? And you probably want them to have as much information as possible. And so I would say, sending out those addendums and those additional agreements is the right thing to do, and leave the enforceability of them for later. In Ontario and some other provinces now, we also have a bit of help from the government on some of those things, because in Ontario there is legislation that provides that no cause of action can be brought against somebody who makes a good faith effort to comply with public health guidance about COVID. And as long as camps are making a good faith effort to comply with public health guidance, then there's no action that can be commenced against them in Ontario. Now, that's untested legislation. It's difficult to know exactly how it's going to be applied by the courts, but it's another piece of protection for summer camps that really are trying to do their best and just get something slightly wrong despite having made that effort.
Yeah. Rachel, your thoughts on these conditions of registration, contractual stuff with families?
Sure. So a little outside my professional wheelhouse, but I can give you kind of some personal anecdotes on these pieces. And so, I have heard that many more, especially overnight camps, are adding a COVID surcharge to their summer tuition to account for testing supplies and PPE and other things of that nature. So if you're thinking about doing it, you should feel comforted that you have some company, and I don't think you'd be an outlier if that's the way you decide to go. From a parent standpoint, I think it goes into this idea that camp is a community and we are all in this together. And, what my older son, who's in first grade, what his school did this year was we all signed a social compact as families. And it's not a contract, it's not binding. No one can bring us to court and sue us. But essentially, the theme of it was we are in this together. And we want our kids to be able to go to school in person and to feel safe about making that decision. And so here are the things that we are going to agree to do as a community in order to create the safest community that we can. And so, in that social compact, we made commitments, not contractual commitments, but social commitments that we would, for example, not have our children play sports indoors without masks. Or, it's been loosened a little bit, but at one point in time, it was that if we traveled out of state, we would follow the quarantine requirements. Or if we traveled internationally, we would remain quarantined. That we would be open and honest with the school if our child was sick. I think still, even a year later, there's a bit of a stigma around somebody having COVID or being exposed. And the school, back to Robin's point about communication and expectations, the school was really clear with us up front. We expect you to talk about this. We want you to talk about this. We don't want you to hide. If your child has a cold, tell us. We can better react and control things if we know in advance. And so having those kind of community engagement reminders, I think, is a nice way to do it with families without saying, sign a new contract, promise me you're not leaving, the state to go down here in Pennsylvania to the Jersey Shore, out of state on your weekends and things like that. And it also helps support that community idea of camp anyways.
As far as, and it's so refreshing because you both come from an angle of camp professional, camp mom, camp dad. Like, it's so refreshing to hear the kinds of things that you generally feel would be accepted and can be, in terms of communication, managed in such a way that's probably consistent with the way we always talk to our families. So it won't be seen as an alarm bell or anything that is out of the norm. So your clientele best, your market best. So I think you're adding that. As I think, and I know, it's so funny to hear Rachel say, like, we could talk for 3 hours about this and all this stuff. And we've had almost an hour of discussion, which could be a whole day discussion. But I think the one thing that a lot of camp operators are struggling with is, when we get too legal, does that scare off our families? And I think the last topic, and I'm preempting we could talk about this for 3 hours stuff, but generally speaking, this place of waivers, we as camp owners get pressure from the insurance companies a lot to say things like, your child could die here. God, like, holy moly. And I've been in sessions and I've heard people say that, or at least recommend that you do that as a protective piece, that you've at least put it out there. The question I have before, as part of the last part of this professional advice kind of stuff is, where do waivers fit into your recommendation for things? Because there are lots of examples of ones that sound like, the fine print of buying a car versus, the ones that are kind of more in keeping with your language, that recognize that people sign off on. And so, Rachel, in your work, in your recommendations to, and while you do a lot on the staff side, generally speaking about waivers, can you offer just some initial thoughts and about that?
Sure. So, specifically on the camp side, in the US, we have workers' compensation, which is, if somebody gets injured or sick at work, your workers' compensation insurance would cover their wages and their medical care and things of that nature. You can't waive workers' compensation claims in the US. So, they're there whether somebody, even if you try to waive it, it's invalid. And so, I think from that perspective, think about, because it's invalid, is it really worth putting out there? Probably not. Also in the US, you can't waive claims under OSHA, which is our Occupational Safety and Health Act. And so from a staff perspective, that's really where the claims are going to come from. Claims under OSHA and claims under workers' comp if somebody gets sick from COVID. And those claims aren't waivable. So there are really good places for waivers. And obviously with respect to waivers, you may have requirements, like you said, Howie, from your insurance companies, and you want to make sure, you're following what you need to do for them so that if something happens, your protection is there. But at the same point, I think if it's not going to help you, there's no reason to put it in. So it is a fine balance, but at least on the staff side, you can have people sign away everything, and ultimately, they're still going to get the workers' compensation benefits or the OSHA benefits.
Yeah, thank you for that. Robin?
Yeah, the same thing applies in Ontario. You can't waive your way out of your employees' rights. Those are protected. As for waivers for parents and campers, the advice that I always give to my clients and the camps who call with questions, or at the conferences that I present at, I always like to say, look, it's true that there are courts out there that won't enforce a waiver, and it's also true that there are courts out there that will. And if you have a waiver and it has information in it that actually provides some information to the parent about what their child has signed up for, what they're going to get into, what kinds of things could happen to them. And I know this is the piece you talked about where the insurer says you should tell the parents that their child could die. But you have to have some information in there just so that everybody knows what they're getting into, eyes wide open, as I said earlier in this conversation. That's a valuable piece of evidence. It's a piece of evidence that you can hold up later and just say, look, this is something everybody knew about. This is something that everybody was aware was going to happen or could happen. And whether it's enforced or not, it's one more piece of information that will end up going before a court, or hopefully, resolved before then, but at least a piece of evidence that just shows what people expected.
Right. So check with your insurance provider and your lawyers to get the right waiver for your operation. Okay, great. Exactly. I just love it. And that was a commercial for that. But you know what, Kelly? We have a new sponsor.
This is exciting. And I think I know this person from my work with Wake.
You sure do. We are so happy to have Camptivities join the Camp Owners podcast. Is your team spending long hours at their desk creating your summer activity schedule? Have they given up on creating the most diverse schedule for your campers? Let Camptivities help you create a balanced and engaging schedule without the mistakes. Camptivities does it all. Day camps, resident camps, auto scheduling, staff scheduling, camper and group scheduling, rainy day scheduling, and so much more. If you're looking for a better way to schedule this summer, Camptivities would love to show you how they can help. Visit camptivities.com to set up a time to chat. Let Camptivities help you get away from your desk and back out to camp. I am really, really happy that I have this particular platform, Kelly. I remember the days of multiple Excel spreadsheets and trying to put multiple cabins, making sure that dance and gymnastics are so many days of the week, etc. at my day camp. And I would encourage anyone who wants to find a really good solution to the challenges of daily scheduling, large camp, small camp, overnight day, I recommend that you check them out. And we are so happy to have Camptivities as one of our sponsors. And shout out to them, Kelly.
Yes, thank you, Camptivities and Ryan Rosen, for making us feel like a big deal with 2 sponsors. This is exciting. All right, we're going to end our show as we always do, which is one of my favorite parts, with what's inspiring us right now, because Lordy knows we need it during this gray, mushy time. So we want to end with something that's inspiring us at this moment. This can be a book, article, podcast, documentary, leadership quote, anything else that's inspiring us to be better camp professionals. So each of us will share, and I will start today. I listened recently to Emmanuel Acho. He is an individual who has, his title of his book is Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. And I was struck by 2 things that he said. Of course, it was a podcast with Brene Brown, but he also has a great book and some other things. But 2 things that he said that I've been thinking about lately is, his quote was, prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. And also he spoke about white privilege, and it's not about money. It's not about wealth. It's about being in a place of power. And I think particularly I've been thinking about that a lot. The voice that I have as a person who is white, who owns a business, and having that privilege to use my voice in that way. So I really, really, really like the way that he speaks about race and what we can all do to contribute to that conversation. So I would highly recommend taking the time to listen or seek out some of his information. Howie, do you want to go next?
I would be happy to. My inspiration this week is volunteers. Last night, at the time of this recording, the Ontario overnight camp community got really good news that we received in writing that there's a commitment from the Ministry of Health and the Ontario government for the opening of overnight camps, which is something that we had not received back in May of 2020. So the efforts of the group that I'm so tied to is the Ontario Camps Association, and the task force that led the charge with building those relationships with provincial government to get them to see the importance of allowing operators to plan for camp and continue to plan for camp. And I think it's just put some more wind in our sails. We know that we're still awaiting the specific guidance, but as I say, and I know all camp owners are saying, we're ready. We can bring it on. We can do this. And so I think this is the first step to breathing a little easier, but the work still is to be done. And to get our government to do this was a big win for us, but there's still more work to do. So, huge shout out, inspired by all the many volunteers that I know exist in every state or province all over the place that are working hard to get people to appreciate more and more what we do, and how camp in many ways is the antidote to what our kids have and our young people who work with us and for us for getting out of this in the best possible way. So that's what's inspiring me today. Who are we going to next?
All right, Robin.
All right, I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. Ever since last March 13th, when my family sort of went into lockdown, and I mean March 13th of 2020, of course. A lot of the news, a lot of the discussion has been really, really serious and very dark, for lack of a better word. And so I started going for long walks just to clear my head and get my exercise, since I'm not getting much exercise sitting at my dining room table at home. And on those walks, I started listening to books on tape. And the book that I listened to recently that I loved the most is a book by a woman named Leigh Bardugo, who is actually a young adult fiction writer and well known for a series of books called Grishaverse, which I have not read, but perhaps some of your camp staff and campers have. But the book that I read is a book that she wrote for grown-ups called Ninth House. And Ninth House was recommended by Stephen King, which is why I started reading it. And I'm a huge Stephen King fan. And it's all about secret societies at Yale and a woman named Galaxy Stern who gets involved with these secret societies in an unexpected way. And it's a very, very entertaining, well-written, and exciting book to listen to, and I'm sure to read as well. So that's what I would like to recommend.
Howie and I always like a good book recommendation, don't we, Howie?
We
My
do.
nightstand seems like it's going to tip over from my stack, but I will add that to my list. All right, Rachel, do you want to go next?
Sure. So in closing, I mean, truly all of you as camp professionals, I think are our inspiration. I mean, for us with children, there is nothing more than my kids want this summer than to be at camp and to be with their friends and to be outside. And I think the commitment from this industry to enable kids to have a summer to be themselves again and to be outside and to be with their friends. I just give you all, everyone, listening to this, everyone, whatever your role is in the camp industry, so much credit because really, for better or worse for you, you are sort of, taking in all of our kids for the summer after, what's been a very challenging and tough year for all of us. And so your willingness to do that, your excitement about doing that, your passion for doing that is inspiring. And we are so grateful as parents that our kids will be in their favorite places and their favorite second homes or their favorite homes, as they call them, for this summer. So thank you to all of you, especially as a parent. I'll be really thrilled to have my kids engaged this summer without me engaging them. I
Hear,
love my
hear.
kids, but just to
Yeah.
make that clear.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's the old story when people who don't understand camp, and I explain that, we have parents that send their kids for 7 and 8 weeks to camp, and I qualify it by saying, and they still love them. Like they still love their kids, and they do that. Because people who don't know camp are like, really? They do that? So another topic altogether. How do you market to those families? There you go. Kelly, put it on the list. What a wonderful discussion, a really important one. And Kelly, I know you'll agree with two people who get it, who've obviously been around camp people long enough to know how do you bridge, as we've said before, the necessary legal considerations with the spirit of what we do and how we do it, and trying to find the sweet spot is so important. So to you, Rachel, and to you, Robin, it's so awesome for Kelly and I when we can bring really smart, amazing, wonderful people together. It's been a part of our blessing for doing all this. So thank you for taking the time. And with that, Rachel, if any of our listeners want to get a hold of you and continue this conversation, what's the best way that they can reach out?
Sure. So you can reach out to me at R Satinsky. It's S as in Sam, A T as in Tom, INSKY at Littler, LITTLER.com. And if you don't remember that, you can also just search Littler Philadelphia, and you'll find me on the page. If you search Littler and camp, I'm the only person in our 1,500 law firm who deals with camps. So that will get you there too.
Amazing. That's awesome. Robin, and you?
Yeah, you can reach me at R Squires, SQUIRES, R Squires at BLG.com. And I'm happy to take your emails. I check my email more often than I probably should. I'd give you my cell phone number too, but I'll take an email first, and then you can have my cell phone number.
We can see you take it from there. Kelly, how do people get a hold of you?
My email is Kelly with a Y at hiddenpinesranch.com.
Awesome. And if you want to get a hold of me, I'm Howie at camprobinhood.ca. Okay, everyone, don't forget you can find all of our show notes at gocamp.pro/ownerspod. You can find the resources that we mentioned in this episode and lots of good stuff there from our show and other Go Camp Pro podcasts out there. We really hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you for listening, and we can't wait to have you listen in on the next Camp Owners Podcast.